Hi, everyone. So it's such an honor to be here. Thank you so much to Professors Rue and Professors Walsh for organizing and inviting me. And it's a tough act to follow. Professor Che's very nuanced and in-depth presentation. I look forward to the conversation with you and Professor Jung, to who I owe an apology. I was like the very last person to submit my paper. In my defense, I think I was also the last person to join. I came on fairly late. But anyways, it's great to be here and at my table sitting with the registered dietitians. They shared their very scientific knowledge that based on the calorie consumption at lunch, most likely many of you will be very sleepy. So my job is just to keep everyone awake. So I at least gave a cute picture. I thought I'd get at least one awe right at the very beginning. So for those of you who don't know, this is an image from Pixar's Bao, which was the first film directed by a woman, Domi Shi, who's Chinese-Canadian. And it was a short that was showed before the Incredibles 2 movie, and sparked a very contrasting responses. So this is just one article here, but again, she was saying that she saw it as a love letter to Asian Americans. It was inspired by her own experiences. So the basic story is, back to the image here, the mother is, her son leaves home, she makes a dumpling that comes to life. It sort of becomes like her substitute child. And then there's like a shocking moment when this dumpling also wants to leave and she eats it. So again, there's clearly a lot going on here in terms of, the dumpling as sort of a metaphor for motherhood, care, and again, sort of the fraught relationships that develop around that. So again, many Asian Americans had a very emotional response to this film, but then we see many whites and non-Asians, the main responses being confusion. I have no idea what was going on in this film. This tweet was saying this was the most confusing 10 minutes of my life, and was shared almost 60,000 times and liked 135,000 times. So again, we see something going on here around, very different emotional resonances with what I'm calling the dumpling dilemma. So I'm using this as a shorthand to bring together theorizing in Asian American and feminist food studies with Korean studies. So I guess I should more precisely say that the dumpling dilemma should be the mandu dilemma, or gyoza, xiaolongbao, or baonbao dilemma, and those are just a few. So again, I think there are different versions for Asian Americans. I'm going to be focusing on, this is based on a larger book project on motherhood as a site of racialization for Asian Americans. I did over 100 interviews. It's coming out with University of California Press, but there were 37 interviews with Korean American mothers, and I'll be focusing on this. So again, this is, I'm playing with this as a theoretical shorthand that captures the contradictory expectations that Asian Americans perform, both cultural identity and authenticity, along with model minority assimilation, and then looking particularly at motherhood as a site for this, again, as not the consumers of the food, but the providers of the food, and how they are expected to fulfill others' desires for easily palatable ethnic food. So I'm building on the work of bell hooks. I noticed several people cited this concept of eating the other in their papers. So again, sort of Hooks talks about the concept of eating the other as, again, sort of food and becoming spice, seasoning that can liven up the dull dish that is mainstream white culture. But here, I want to say that there's been a shift from eating the other to what I call eating with the other. It's sort of like the other as the cultural guide to the food. And then I also want to make a shift in perspective from that of white consumers to Asian Americans, and particularly Asian American mothers as the providers of the food, that they are eating as the other and also having to feed as the other. So the study is, again, based on interviews. The article is sort of a hybrid piece that brings in interdisciplinary feminist methods, reflexive writing, and again, sort of data from interviews. There's some autoethnography and some literary and media criticism in there. So what is the dumpling dilemma? And I'll give you sort of 3 versions of it, and then I'd like you to hear from you about what you think of other versions. So the first is this, based on this concept of feeding the family, which is Marjorie DeVoe's concept from the book by that name, which is about feeding the family as gendered caring labor. Feminist food studies, and particularly the work of Akian and Haber, this book from Betty Crocker to Feminist Food Studies, interrogates how gender inequality shapes cooking, eating, and meanings of food across cultures. So for Korean Americans, the interview data I found was, as Professor Chet and Professor Son, just learning how to cook Korean food is a huge endeavor. So then you have Korean Americans who are trying to learn this. So my study is mostly 1.5 and second generation, so people who grew up here. So they're having to, again, sort of learn food that they learned that they might not have eaten, or ate a very hybridized version due to lack of ingredients, or again sort of just their own mother's cooking skills. So this is a quote from Grace Jo's memoir, Tastes Like War. So first of all, the title, Tastes Like War, refers to her brother gives her mother some powdered milk, and her mother doesn't want to drink it, and Grace says why, and she says it tastes like war. So again, sort of it shows the very complicated context of eating in the Korean diaspora, given the history of the Korean War, and then her mother's very complicated history. It's unclear. She's married to an American GI. It's unclear. She did work in the camp downs. It's unclear she was a sex worker, and then she develops schizophrenia. So beautiful, very complicated piece of writing. But I thought this part was really interesting, which it talks about in the book, but then this is her quote. This is actually from an NPR interview where she says, my mother did not accept my cooking. We argued over it. She refused to eat it. I'm sure there was a lot going on behind her reasons for that, but I know one of them was that she has always been consistent in saying to me, I don't want you to waste your time cooking because you're supposed to be studying. So again, many Korean American young women grew up being specifically told not to cook at home, and then certainly not to go into cooking as any kind of career. The whole model minority dream is to get out of those kinds of service jobs. So then when they become mothers and then are expected not just to cook ethnic food for their own families, but to perform it in various spaces, particularly things like school potlucks, neighborhood events, fundraisers, and business dinners, it becomes this very fraught relationship with food, especially as Korean food is increasing in popularity. So this is what I call dumpling dilemma 2, which is how Asian American mothers become the conduits to, where people are expected them to introduce or provide them with, again, sort of not just ethnic food, but sort of a multicultural eating experience. So I thought this was an interesting image here of, where dumplings are as popular as pizza, and you see, again, sort of white children here, eating food. Interesting, this article was about how both dumplings and pizza are unhealthy for children, and you shouldn't overfeed them. So this was a quote from an interview. She's a Chinese American mother who, she said she would go to school every year for, what she called the Spring Festival, what the school called Chinese New Year. And she said she tried to make it not just about eating, Chinese food, but as she said, if you try to break out of a stereotype and do culture in a more complicated way, there's no audience. They look at me like, this is boring. Where are the dumplings? Okay, so this leads to dumpling dilemma 3, which I saw is sort of the culinary tour guide to the exotic. And this is also, a very gendered version here, so sort of like an Anthony Bourdain type food adventure. So the backstory here is, I was sharing this paper with a colleague of mine who's a 1.5 generation Korean American man living near LA, Koreatown. And, and here I am in suburban Massachusetts. So where my version of the dumpling dilemma was to, again, sort of do very like homey, palatable, familiar dumplings, his immediate response was like, he didn't get what the dumpling dilemma was, and his response was like, oh, they expect you to take them out for pogo, so like this is this, possibly poisonous puffer fish. But again, sort of his understanding of the dumpling dilemma was that people wanted this like very exotic, dangerous food adventure kind of experience. So here we have Eric Kim's book, so he's a celebrity chef. He wrote this book, Korean American Food That Tastes Like Home. So I just want to preface, I love this book. I think it's great. But it's, but I'm just, I think both his approach to cooking and sort of the sharing of his own family experiences, but it's very interesting, and I think this is a very gendered thing, that he very explicitly says from the beginning, this is not my mother's cooking, this is my adaptation, and my, that Korean American cuisine is not Korean cuisine. And then, for example, in his recipe for kimchi bokkeumbap, he adds a raw egg to it, and again, sort of with this sort of like, you have to be a little bit like living on the wild side to do this, and he said, make sure you have confidence in the egg, So, again, sort of different kind of gendered performances of this and of the dumpling dilemma. So I want to just go briefly over some of the interview data and how this connection between food, culture, identity, and performance of multiculturalism comes up in different sites of motherhood. So within the family, this is a quote from Ginny, a second-generation Korean-American mother in California, where she says, I've lost the language, I've lost the culture, at least I can pass on the love of the food to my children. So, and then in larger community spaces, this is Yuna in New York, where she's saying, she says, people are happy to eat Asian food, but not if they have to take off their shoes. So she says in her home, she's very adamant about, people taking off their shoes when they come. And she said, you would be shocked at how much this causes a rub with people. And so she said, literally, people want to come to my house because they know I cook really good Korean food, but they're very, she said, one person even said, I'll come for the barbecues outside, but she doesn't want to come inside because she doesn't want to take off her shoes. And then the workplace as a site of work-family negotiations also is very contested. So this is Grace, who's a mixed race white Korean-American mother in San Francisco. And she says, in her workplace, they expect me to recommend restaurants and dishes, even when we're in Chinatown. She says, everyone knows I'm Korean, but even in Chinatown, they expect me to make food recommendations. And then she says, I'm not really the foodie type, but I've had to become one because, God forbid, I send my boss or some clients to a crappy restaurant. So here she's, playing the role of culinary tour guide, but also this very gendered role as sort of the office mother who's there to, again, sort of cater to and fulfill others' needs, and particularly their eating needs. How am I doing on time? Okay. So, there's this famous maxim, tell me what you eat and I will tell you what you are. I think it's, this is the quote, the source here is Arlene Avakian's review of recent food memoirs in feminist studies, but I think the original quote is from the 1500s or something. Sorry, I don't have the exact quote, but I think this has been adopted much less poetically in the adage, you are what you eat. But I think for many Korean Americans, it's not just what you eat, but what you don't eat, and what you can't eat or feel like you can't eat. whether it's because of lack of access to the ingredients, lack of knowledge of how to prepare it, or a lack of acceptance of the food. And kimchi is now very popular, but everyone can, my previous book was on nail salons, and one of the many of them had kitchens in the back, and many of them shared that the boss says they would bring a dish and share a communal meal, and many of them said the boss says don't bring kimchi because when you're serving, when you're doing the manicures, people don't like the, kimchi nemse. But that's changed now. Like kimchi now has become so popular, but again, there's sort of like this negotiation still of like, well, how popular is it? Is it popular enough that if people smell it, that they're not offended by it? So since I have a little bit of time here, I'm just going to read this, again, sort of my autoethnographic account of my own dumpling dilemma as a mother. So this is, from an incident in my daughter's school. So if you'll just bear with me, I'll just share this. My mother is visiting us, so I want to take advantage of the opportunity to learn how to make japchae with her and my daughter and to share the dish at the elementary school potluck. We stop at the Asian market to shop for ingredients, and my mother throws packages of shiitake mushrooms into the cart. But I remember that my grandmother used to make it with mogibosot, the woodier mushrooms. So I say this to my mother, but my mother's response is, Americans like shiitake better. They think the woodier mushrooms are too slimy and they look dirty. So I suppressed my knee-jerk reaction to argue with her, for on some level, I realized that she is right. Rather than an intergenerational bonding over food, now the tastes of the Americans who will judge the dish loom large, overriding my grandmother's traditional way of cooking. Still, even after adjusting the recipe to suit their perceived tastes, we end up bringing over half the noodles back home. The next day, as I heat up the leftovers for my daughter, she announces, I think we should just bring dumplings to school. So I ask, why? Don't you like japchae? And she says, I like it, but other people don't. Plus, the dumplings are famous. So I'm curious, and I say, famous, how do you know? And she replies, when we walked in, I heard some people say, the dumplings are here, the dumplings are here. And I think they were disappointed that we didn't bring them. Once more, I suppressed my initial reaction. I'm not even sure what that reaction should be. Anger, hurt, laughter. I want to explain to her that people at the school should not merely see our family as the providers of dumplings, and that being Asian American is about a lot more than serving others the foods that they like. But I decide that she is too young to understand any of these reactions, so I just smile, knowing that on some level, just like my mother, she is also right. We are expected to share famous yet familiar food, food that doesn't look dirty or disappoint. In other words, we should just bring dumplings. Or should we? So I will leave you with that.
Should we invite the authors to the stage, perhaps? And then I'll do a little bit of my little commenting, discussion, and hopefully we can get our conversation going. Thank you so much for these very, very engaging papers. I very much enjoyed them. Yes, it was a bit of a last night read, but I still very much enjoyed it and was very relatable as a Korean American mother myself. So I have some questions. They may not be as cohesive. We are seeing very interesting two different kinds of aspects of how Korean culture is being manifested in different kinds of contexts, and especially in a particular time period, I think. And one is manifested through the home cooking practices that we are, witnessing in Korea, and very much highly profiled in various media sources. And then we're also seeing, food as a very important and very fraught cultural marker for identity politics in the United States, especially among the Asian American mothers, particularly in this case, the Korean American mothers. So I'm going to pose a couple of questions, not so much for both papers, but individually, and then I'll try to kind of put it together in some sort of fashion that makes us maybe think about more questions that we could discuss in the remaining time. So what struck me really as a very interesting phenomenon, especially in the framework that Professor Choi was using of the gender, male entering the home cooking domain seems really interesting, particularly because it is so visualized these days with the various kinds of media channels that we have. And Baek Jong-won is a really, really good example. But I'm just wondering whether in the broader theoretical question of the politics of gender domesticity, right, especially in the context of Korea, whether this is actually not so much about the neoliberalization and the reflection of that neoliberal ethos as much as the shifting meanings and connotations around jjigae that is very much generationally shifting. And I'll come back to that to illustrate that a little bit. But so my question was really about whether it is really maybe an indication of a changing meaning of family and parenthood instead of a motherhood versus a fatherhood itself in contemporary Korea, especially since you brought up the point about the one-person family becoming such a, or increasingly more of a normative kind of thing. And it is not just for the young people, but also the elderly. And that brings a very interesting question about where, you know, when we think about jjigae as a cultural kind of meaning, it is very much associated with the connotation of comfort. And it is, you know, of course, also reflected in how people think about jjigae as something eating together, right? But if it is juxtaposed with this kind of changing phenomenon of one-person household becoming more normative, right, in both spectrum of the younger who are not getting married, but also the elderly who are not living traditionally with the younger generations, but actually having a one-person household. What does that actually tell us about this notion of jjigae associated with commensality, eating together, and the comfort that is evoked in those kinds of contexts? So I'm just left with wondering about whether maybe in this particular historical juncture in Korea, maybe this particular case of jjigae really gives us an opportunity to denaturalize jjigae as a cultural marker of a gender domain, maybe. And perhaps, you know, it also can raise the question about what does this phenomenon illuminate in terms of the changing conceptions of family or parenthood instead of just motherhood versus fatherhood. And also the commensality that is often part of the nostalgia for this jjigae, right? And that's probably why you see in the interview data more commonly this thing being associated with mothers cooking, even though that may not, that too may be really shifting. And I'm saying this because I notice in my generation of my friends and colleagues in Korea, a lot of my male friends are very avid cooks. Out of necessity because they might be a single parent home and they are the primary caregiver, or out of the gender division of labor they agreed upon with their spouses. So I think the adding that kind of generational component in interpreting the meaning of what that actually means might be a very productive way to think about what this actually indicate about the larger gendered labor and dynamics, especially within the, you know, in the period of neoliberalized, ethos, whether that is really about the gendered dynamic, or whether that is signaling something else to us that we can make that invites us to think about. Especially when you mentioned the Jjajangmyeon, I think that is a very common kind of joke that has been circulating widely. And you know, when I talk to my friends of similar kind of age generation, that is middle age, they also talk a lot, and I mean very seriously, not just in joking manners, that they are really, really keen on teaching their sons how to cook. And Jjajangmyeon is brought up a lot. There's also this kind of ongoing half-joking way of saying, like, if you want a really good daughter-in-law, you need to teach your son how to cook. Otherwise, you may not get a good daughter-in-law, right? Or your son may may end up being with, with a difficult wife. So I am really curious to learn a little bit more about the kind of varied perspective coming from the different generations rather than in one kind of particular thing, and what that actually can tell us about this whole spectrum meaning of chipbap, which is I think very, very provocative in thinking about what this kind of food offers us in terms of understanding the changing cultural meanings and dynamics. In that regard, I was also reminded by food scholar and anthropologist Rick Wilkes' work on home cooking in Belize. And he actually says in his book, metaphorically, home cooking means a cuisine grounded in familiar shared history and in common knowledge of places and people. Home cooking is always concerned with quality because people you care about will eat the meal. Home cooking, homemaking is a social process of transformation, the magic that makes the anonymous commodity into something unique with an individual identity. So here, I was really interested in thinking about and connecting your work and your data with the whole quality as being an index of what the meaning, the contemporary meaning and the shifting meaning of chipbap might signal. And so if we are thinking about in those terms, maybe that whole idea of one person's household and the whole range of things that gets attached with chipbap, right, can be also understood in terms of this quality being a key kind of marker in what it actually means. And that also brings a very interesting question about why is this such a big deal? Why is this being even talked about so much in the public discourse, whether it is the man who is capitalizing on the home cooking more than the women? And I'm not sure whether that is really the case, but definitely they did gather a lot more media attention for sure. And that could be maybe why we have that perception that this is kind of the case. But I'm also thinking of this banchan kage that has been, especially in the neoliberal youth when there are a lot of working women, this home-cooked side dishes that are being sold and has been very much a mom and pop store kind of phenomenon for many, many decades right now. It's not just very recent. I'm wondering whether what that actually has, what kind of connection it has with this whole chipbap phenomenon versus the, everyday practice of, buying the so-called homemade food from the banchan kage in contemporary Korea. So those are some of the thoughts that I thought might be really interesting to think about, but I think the connection of quality, maybe chipbap is not just about comfort, but also accessing some quality food, right? And that helps to take care of not just the others, but also myself in the case of the one-person household. Maybe that is another way to think about this whole phenomenon that is not so much centered on the gender, but also in the broader kind of connotation of what that actually, the shifting kind of meanings mean. In terms of the dumpling dilemma, I mentioned that I was very, I highly enjoyed it because it was so relatable, especially the autoethnographic parts that you last read about, well, let's put the shiitake in instead of the mogi bosot, the wood ear mushrooms, because it's more palatable for the audience or whoever the eater might be. That really struck a lot of deal because whenever I'm entertaining at home, I'm also wondering, should I go really with the traditional route and serving the so-called authentic version, or should I make it more palatable to the eaters that I'm going to entertain? And if we are putting this in the the context of America and the identity politics around Asian American, I think this is a very, very important kind of dilemma that Professor Kang is bringing to the table. She mentions that dumpling dilemma is basically the fraught negotiations around fulfilling others' desires for a taste of the other. And I think that is really a very interesting kind of way to think about the kind of performance of identity. And especially how, again, as the generation shifts, right, from the first to the second and the third, how do we actually perform that cultural identity? And does that actually change the meaning of authenticity as well, right? So again, as an anthropologist, I'm really interested in kind of unpacking some of these assumptions and separating, if possible, the process from the essence. And when we're thinking about either the socially constructed categories, culture, or authenticity, I think we tend to kind of focus on the essence of those things, those categories. But what if this is really always a fluid, and you both mentioned in your papers that culture itself is a very fluid and unbounded kind of thing, and yet it is still being kind of performed and expected to be performed in certain kinds of bounded way. But could we do something about that performance, or is there a way to kind of intervene so that we are not really putting the focus on the essence as much as the process and trying to unpack those things in those terms? So I'm reminded by an anthropologist, particularly Rory, who talks about authenticity as something that is the degree to which something is more or less what it ought to be, rather than what it is, right? So this is very interesting because it is certainly not an issue for most of the insiders according to his definition, but it is really, authenticity is really more about the outsiders perceiving what an authentic thing should be. And again, he's also invoking the kind of issue of quality here. Typically, the insider's concern is about quality, whereas the outsider's concern is really more about this performance of the thing, the essence. And that makes me wonder whether we can think about whether there are ways to kind of think about this culture as something that is not so grounded in some kind of essence, but something that is continuously changing. So just like the local is continuously inventing themselves, we cannot assume there is always an authentic local either, because time changes, meanings get different interpretation out of it. So this leads me to this kind of broader kind of question and thinking about maybe these two papers really invite us to unpack some cultural and epistemological assumptions that are emerging while we are looking these kinds of phenomena through the lens of Korean food and culture. And they invite us to raise some new questions based on this particular context of Korean food and culture in a comparative and cross-cultural kind of sense. This is not to generalize whether the Korean food phenomena or the Korean food culture can actually, be applied to some other context. But I think it is really, really interesting to think about these the new questions it raises for other locales or contexts. So, in that kind of spirit, I drew out three questions that maybe we can start thinking about, and that is, what might the study of Korean home cooking provide as new questions about home cooking in the US or other locales, especially as it relates to gender dynamics and politics? And when it comes to the dumpling dilemma, which is a shorthand for the contradictory expectation that Asian American perform for cultural authenticity through the sharing of Asian food, while also signaling model minority assimilation. What might the dumpling dilemma raise as a new question, not only in the globalized world, but also in the age of decolonization? So implications for other racialized minority groups, where food becomes always a very key and important medium in the performance of cultural identity. And then lastly, given that food is such an important cultural marker, might writing against or with culture, as Professor Kang mentioned in the paper, for example, start with thinking about ways to unpack culture as a process rather than essence, to capture its dynamic and fluid nature. How might this help us contribute to the ongoing anti-colonial and anti-racist projects through our works in studying this really, really compelling and engaging food phenomena? So I think what I want to conclude with is the idea that whether it is the case with chipbap in 21st century Korea, where a particular gender dynamic may be manifesting, especially and perhaps because of the changing neoliberal ethos that is different from its earlier decade right after the Cold War, or whether it is the case of the dumpling dilemma in 21st century America, where it may be casted in a more nuanced debates around white supremacy and demystifying the model minority myth, maybe these compelling papers using food as a lens to interrogate these important social and moral questions can be a very accessible way for us to think and consider these different kinds of larger questions that I think are demonstrated really well in the 2 case studies that we heard. Thank you. Responses first, or should we just invite the audience to chime in with the questions? Well, maybe why don't we just first start with giving you some chance to kind of...
How much time we have for?
10 minutes?
10 minutes? Yeah. Would you like to field more questions so that maybe
well, why don't we just hear a quick response?
Quick response? Okay,
yeah,
great.
A couple of minutes each, and then we'll open it to the floor.
Okay, I mean, you touch on all the important issues for me, so thanks so much for really capturing, again, some of the major points I have been struggling with, but also exploring. I think throughout my work history, I have been always interested in particular historical moments in which there seems to be some kind of fluctuation in terms of gender dynamics. What caused this gender dynamics or changes in this particular moment? So that's always kind of one of the consistent question. And so far, one of the recurring conclusion is that there is a superficial changes here and there, but the undercurrents of the very male-centered social arrangement continues. So when I say patriarchy adapts itself brilliantly, actually, to the new circumstances with the different strategies and technique and mechanisms, and I see jjigae phenomenon fits in that category as well. So during the interviews, I interview people who are in their 20s to early 60s, and there is a generational difference significantly. Young generation in their 20s and 30s, the vast majority of them live alone. In fact, they actually love to eat alone, hombap, because they don't have.
Commensality is not even an issue anymore.
Exactly. I mean, they miss mom's cooking, but they actually are comfortable with eating alone because they don't have to worry about other people's preference. When they go out with the colleagues and friends, they have to watch out, okay, who wants what, and they try to accommodate others' needs, which is so womanly virtue, in my view. But now, alone, they could choose whatever one. That's one thing. And also, unlike older generation, they don't care whether they like to cook, they don't cook well. They are very upfront about, I don't cook or I don't like to cook. And so, I mean, they're very comfortable about that situation, unlike early, older generation. So that's, and also I think this is a kind of situation, especially from 1980s and 90s and on, the idea of a chip, the idea of chip and family has been really transformed. And I think that transformation seems to create a situation where a lot of things we take for granted for decades and centuries no longer common, normal, or average practices. So home meals is one of the examples, and delivery food is so common. And instead of what should you cook tonight, now people ask what should you order for dinner. So this is a kind of the new trend, and that sort of change also seems to impact on gender dynamics a little bit. But again, when it comes to profit, men always take advantage of the moment while dismissing women. I mean, in fact, home cooking is a very symbolic but also most representative example of effective labor. Yeah. And in this neoliberal economy, effective labor is so important because it really counts emotion, relationship, communication, care, and all these things women have been doing for centuries. And so to me, I'm kind of tracing these kind of dynamics in the phenomenon of jjigae and how women's labor, which used to be dismissed as unproductive labor, and now finally productive labor, counted as a productive labor, and yet appropriated by men again in this. In fact, in my actual paper, I did mention early film history here in the United States before silence was adopted, and women used to be actually a major part of filmmaking. But once film industry became industrialized and capitalized, of course, the men dominate even until now. So I kind of try to make some kind of parallel here, and so as you point out some comparative perspective on home meals in different parts of the world, that might be really interesting. But some deep understanding of the specific place and history in Korea, for example, could add some interesting narrative
Yeah, I
and
think the
examples.
historicized approach is really important because the generational shift is really rapidly happening,
Yeah.
as you noticed, with the numbers too from the one-person household. I think that itself is a very interesting, like kind of gateway to understand the specificity of the shifting meanings of that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, so many great questions. I want to hear from other folks, but just quickly, I think your question about framing it in the context of decolonization and neoliberalism and is very important. And I'm thinking about Eric Kim's like posturing where he is like very assertive that Korean American food is not inferior to Korean food. And like he starts off by saying, sundubu jjigae was actually invented in LA and then brought back to Korea. So this whole idea of authenticity, and so again, as a Korean American, I felt very conflicted because he's saying like we don't have to pretend like we are the same as Koreans who grew up in Korea, and we don't cook and eat the same way as the Koreans in Korea. So, but then there's this
Hierarchy.
yeah, or again, sort of this, there's such a fraught relationship already, the Korean-American relations and where Korean Americans and other Korean diasporic subjects fit into that. Mm-hmm. But he's just saying, like, we don't have to measure up to Korean versions, to Korean people's demands for authenticity. And, so just another autoethnographic moment here. So my mom is actually a very good cook, and like Grace too, I did not learn to cook from her because there was a right or wrong way to do everything. And I remember like this horrifying childhood moment where she told me to prep the vegetables for the japchae. And I cut the carrots like in coins. And she came in and she like hit the roof and she's like, don't you know how to cut the carrots? And I said, no, I don't know, And then like there was like the exact same moment where she was teaching it to my daughter. And my daughter was just like, I want to know the right way to do it. And so your question about like the food and the transmission of Koreanness, across generations, whereas that first, second generation thing was like, I'm supposed to know how to do this and I don't. Where she is like the next generation is saying, no, I don't know this, so I want to learn the proper Korean way to do it because she's sort of one generation removed from it. But again, I think it raises complexities about, on the one hand, we recognize culture as this very dynamic, it's not static. It's, we heard from this morning, like chilies, rice, all of these things that are staples of Korean food, are products of colonialism and, all of these different, global processes. And at the same time, I think that there needs to be some respect for traditions that have evolved around Korean food. Just like, just like we would bristle if, white Americans just said, we're going to cook this dish this way. I'm a little hesitant to just give Korean Americans like totally free license to say you don't have to worry at all about what the traditional way of cooking things is, because you're calling it Korean American. But you're not calling it like fusion, so there's sort of this like very slippery line between like what is authentic cooking, what is like adaptation or evolution, what is superior or inferior. And then there's also this very gendered piece of it, which is like, I'm not even trying to cook like my mother, and I wonder if a daughter could say that, like, that freely, like, that's how my mother did it, I'm putting a raw egg in mine, and I like it.
But but I think this is the interesting thing about your paper. I think it really does signal the fact that when we are just situating that particular thing in a historical context, right, we don't have to feel that there is an essence of authenticity, but it is always shifting, even though we imagine it as something that is, of an ethos. I think really that that really helps us get out of this reification or re-essentialization of culture as a thing when it is really a constant changing thing. So those were kind of my thoughts, because I'm struggling with the depiction of culture thing too, and especially when it comes to the performance of identity through very strong cultural markers such as food, I think. It's really hard to
do people just want to throw out questions?
Yeah,
And
sure.
at least we can hear the questions. Robert, and in the back.
Yes, please, Youngju.
So, at Haewol, as I was listening to your fascinating talk, one word popped into my head and it would just not let me go. That word is actually 삼식이, the horror of all horrors of a husband, a man who stays home and expects 3 square meals from his wife,
Yeah.
which was kind of a post-IMF phenomenon.
Yeah.
And I was thinking, actually, that 집밥 phenomenon may not be unrelated to the 삼식 phenomenon in some essential way. I don't know any Korean guy, my generation, who praises his wife's cooking publicly. He may enjoy it very much, but I have not heard that being a thing, whereas it's utterly romanticized and acceptable and filial to praise one's mother's cooking. So this coupled term, wise mother, good wife, I wonder if that coupling has been decoupled, where the 집밥 phenomenon is concerned, and whether the capitalization of 집밥 by men has something to do with that initial decoupling. Yeah.
Should I ask? Do you have time? Okay. Thank you for really excellent question here. In fact, at least based on my interview, those women interviewee whose husbands actually make a pretty good money, and some of the women actually very proud of the fact that their husband always come home to eat, even if they have a 회식, like eating together with other colleagues. Rather they want to come home because I think the 집밥 is much better than, and etc. However, especially after IMF, many traditional breadwinners were fired and laid off and loss of their economic power. And in that context, the kind of the family dynamic changes. Women step in sometimes, and once they gain a little bit of some economic autonomy, they seem to raise their voice about who cooks and what kind of food they could cook, and in fact they don't care whether a husband like it or not, kind of things. So there are some kind of gender dynamics kind of here or there. But at the same time, our young generation seems to be very practical about cooking rather than gender thing. Actually, they say who has more experience and who has more interest, and then decide, you do laundry,
exactly.
That's, exactly. So men who, especially in the army, those who was in charge of kitchen, have a lot of experience, and so no problem cooking at home after marriage. But woman, no interest in cooking, but I don't care. I mean, I don't mind actually doing laundry, for example. So they do negotiate. So this type of some new negotiation seems to be really growing among the young generation, and older generation still kind of stuck to this old gender division. But even so, even within this conventional division of labor, professional women in the 50s and 60s try to navigate between compliance with the norms, what is expected for them, but also trying to find some new space for their own empowerment by doing totally different things. So the compromise and
Do you have, yes? Yeah. Right over there.
The notion of 집밥, how is that connected to 손맛? Because I think there is a evolution also in home cooking, especially in Korea. If you go to H Mart, half the stuff there is already made food. So even when you cook at home, I think you're cooking food that is already cooked by a corporation, like Bibigo, whatever it is. but it's at home. But is it maybe what people are longing for is this 손맛 or the
손맛.
hand taste and not necessarily the home food? Because home food can be also factory made, right?
That's
so I
right.
don't know, do
That's
you have any
right.
thought on that?
So 손맛 again, whose 손? mom's 손. mom's 손맛, 엄마의 손맛. I mean, there is actually a blog, very famous blog there too, and so so you kind of continue on that kind of on that line here, but at the same time, I think we in the case of women, for example, they have kind of mixed feeling about home meal. On one hand, they want it to be like mom, if mom cook well, want it to be mom, and they're not really good enough. On the other hand, they want to follow the footsteps of mothers. So they have a very conflicted feeling about home meals. And and of course, 손맛 is almost like overrated in some sense. And I bet a lot of housewives or mothers do not cook well. But can you imagine the kind of pressure and the burden they have to feel throughout their life?
All right, I think we have maybe question for one more time for one more question. Yeah, yes, really quick.
I don't know if it can be really quick, but really enjoyed the conversations from both of you. And as we were discussing at our table, because so much of your data was collected through interviews, we're very curious about the aspect of the convenience foods or who else is preparing foods. And you especially alluded to that with the openness towards restaurant meals, eating out. What we notice in our field is a lot of moral signaling around the identity of whether you do or do not cook. So we're just curious if you can quickly offer any insights that you may have gotten from these interviews about whether we see that same modeling of, you know, I am morally better because I cook, or I feel pressure to perform that aspect of it. So any thoughts?
Absolutely. I didn't have a chance to address that issue because there are a lot of some food in convenience store as well as that ready-to-eat food available to purchase. And I think young people live alone. When they pick up food from the store, they feel kind of bad. They feel like they don't take care of themselves. They don't respect their own body and mind by picking up anything that is just convenient. So there is a kind of a longing to take care of themselves, and yet their circumstances, their work life, their pace of life simply do not allow them to do that. And also social class-wise, lack of income, who could afford to buy expensive fruit, for example? So there is a lot of class issues in thinking of. You know, there is also blurred line between restaurant food and home meal. And again, this is also class issues as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So I'm Kara's emo, so I'm like, isn't she smart? So I think that moral signaling isn't just about the fact of like, did you put in the time, like a gendered, like, did you put in all the care, et cetera. But again, what I'm trying to get at is it's like, do you know your identity? You know, are you, like, do you know how to cook culturally authentic food? And then the willingness to, you know, like one of the interviews was like, they want me to make kimbap, and it's so much work to, you know, and she, you know, she's like, I don't live in a place where you can just go buy it. So there's that like gendered piece of it combined with like this racialized performance of identity that makes, you know, the moral negotiations even more complicated, I think, for Korean Americans.
Can I just add one very quick episode? I invited a family of American friends, and they have a daughter. The daughter brought chopstick when they came, assuming I would cook Korean food. We cook actually, I don't know, maybe Indian food, or maybe we didn't cook Korean food, but there is assumption because I'm Korean, simply because I'm Korean, there is a whole expectation I would cook Korean food. I love to challenge their perception.
But thank you so much. We don't, you know, if anyone wants to talk more, feel free to come up and talk to us.
Thank you so much. That was an amazing panel, and I hope we do get to talk more about that as we move forward. And I think running 10 minutes behind is not bad for mid-afternoon. So I just want to let everyone know we will take about 10 minutes and come back here at like a soft 2:30.